This is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Today, I'm here with Major Heather Penny. She is an outstanding individual who served as a pilot and was literally one of the first pilots, or the first pilot, to respond to what was happening in 9/11. Many of you may recall what took place in 9/11 was that two different airplanes flew into the Twin Towers, and then another one flew into the Pentagon. But a fourth airplane, Flight 93, had to be responded to because what was being suspected was that that plane was going to be flown into the White House. Heather was one of the very first pilots to respond to that. She's also served 2 tours in Iraq, and now she's with a military institute that's taking a look at the strategic issues that exist around the world and the role that the United States has to play. We're going to have a discussion not only about that harrowing story that took place on 9/11, we're going to also talk about her career as a female pilot and how it is that she recommends the Air Force and the military for other young men and women. And most importantly, we're going to talk about what's evolving, the current geopolitical situation that is evolving around the world and the role that the United States military has to play and what we have to do to be prepared for it. It's an exciting show. You're going to like what it is that we're doing, and thanks for being with us. Now, if you like this show and you like what we're doing, make certain that you press that subscribe button or go to the optamerican.com/premium and become one of our premium members. Either way, I can't thank you enough for being with us today. Add any comments. We love reading your comments and hearing anything that you have to say about the show that we have, whether you agree with us or disagree with us. And now, on with Officer Penny. Heather, I'd like to welcome you to the Optimistic American show today.
Paul, thank you so much. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with you and your guests.
All right, so what I'd like to start with, Heather, is I know you retired as a major, but I want to go all the way back to that date in 9/11/2001. On that morning, about 8:46, I believe the time was, there was a 736 plane that flew into one of America's Twin Towers. And about 18 minutes later, a second one flew in. Flight 93 was a fascinating flight that many Americans followed that had 44 people on board. And there was speculation that it was headed either for the White House or for another American facility, American political facility. At that point in time, you were a pilot. I believe you were one of the few female pilots, but you were tasked with taking that plane down, I believe. And if you don't mind, walk me through from the moment that you first heard about what was going on, the mission that you had to fly. Give us the details of that day.
The first place to begin is just how that day began for everyone, for every American, because it was just an ordinary Tuesday. On the East Coast, the weather was spectacular. The sky was just crystal blue with only a light puff of wind coming out of the southwest. I was sitting in a scheduling meeting. I'm a brand new lieutenant in my fighter squadron. I'm the only female fighter pilot, the first one that they've had. I had just gotten to the fighter squadron from my formal training in the F-16 in January of that year. So we had gotten back from Red Flag, which is the Air Force's premier go-to-war exercise that weekend previously. And so we really had just a skeleton crew there in the fighter squadron. D.C. Air National Guard, the 121st Fighter Squadron, 113th Wing. So if people are hearing the National Guard piece of that, you're right. Normally we're made up of part-timers. There's a few full-timers that are there on a daily basis, but the vast majority of our personnel come in once, twice, 3 times a month, plus the drill weekend to get their training flights in. But then they're airline pilots on the outside. So as a new guy, I was still in my seasoning days, so I was a full-timer, and we're sitting in a scheduling meeting. Really, it's just kind of the administration of the squadron, running the squadron, who's available to fly, who needs check rides, and so forth, what our range space is. And that's when David Chunks Callahan walks into the squadron. Into the room. He was one of our enlisted troops and said, an airplane flew into the World Trade Center. And we looked at each other and we looked outside at the window, and it was a spectacularly clear day. And from DC to New York, the weather is we normally share weather patterns. So we were like, how does that happen? And we thought it was probably a tourist aircraft. Maybe they had some fog up and down the Hudson. It made a wrong turn and bounced off one of the buildings. So we made a few, inappropriate jokes and got back to work. And it wasn't until Chunks came back a second time and said, a second aircraft hit the second World Trade Center. It's on purpose, that we got up and we went to the fighter squadron bar. And there we saw what everyone else in America saw on television. And that was the images of the airliners crashing into the Twin Towers with those huge fireballs of flames. At that point in time, we knew what needed to be done. We had to get airborne and we had to protect. And I remember being so angry and so impatient because we're the DC Air National Guard. The capital, the nation's capital, the capital of the free world is where we live. And yet we have no way to be able to get airborne, no way to be able to protect. You see, if you go back in time, and this is a little bit of a history lesson, after the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the nation demanded a peace dividend. They were sick and tired of Reagan-era spending on national defense. And so literally, they cut the Air Force in half. The nation cut the Air Force in half. And that included all of our alert squadrons that used to ring the nation's borders to protect us from outside threats, Soviet bombers. So when they did that, the DC Guard lost the alert mission. So here we are, a National Guard unit. We have no live weapons. Oh, and this is the other thing. We don't fly around in training sorties with live weapons on board. We have shapes. We have shapes of missiles that are, loaded up with concrete. They've got the right electronics. They plug into the jet, so they talk, they act, they smell just like a real weapon, but there's no motor, there's no explosives, there's no fuses, there's nothing that's going to be able to make it go boom, right? And we do that for good reason, right? People don't want us flying around over their heads with live explosive ordnance. So as long as we can get the training that we need out of those training missiles, out of those training bombs, then that's all that's necessary. So we didn't have any live munitions loaded up on the airplanes. And the munitions that we did have in the bomb dump, they were not assembled. So you see the components of weapons, whether it's the guidance kit or the fuse or the explosives or other elements of the weapon body, they have inspections that may or may not be synchronized with the others. And so they need to be tested, and they get tested before they're built up. They're more like Legos than anything else. So it would take time for us to get those missiles built up. The other piece of our problem was we needed to get authorization to get airborne. And as the District of Columbia Air National Guard, our chain of command doesn't function like state guard units where their governor is their commander-in-chief in peacetime. Our governor is not the mayor of DC. I mean, our commander-in-chief is not the mayor of DC. Our commander-in-chief is the president of the United States. And as you can imagine, President Bush was pretty busy at that time. So we really had two major problems. We needed to get authorization to get airborne, and we had to build up some weapons. But we wouldn't get those missiles in time. Our wing commander, Brigadier General David Worley, had come down from the wing building to the operations room down at the squadron. And he was on the phone and he was trying to get us that authorization to launch. So he's working the chain of command. He's pushing up the chain of command, trying to find someone who has the authorization to tell us to get airborne and to set up a defensive combat air patrol. Mark Sasseville, who was our director of operations at the time, he's kind of going around the chain of command, because at Andrews Air Force Base, which is where we live on the east side, the reserve side of the base, that's where Air Force One lives. And anytime Air Force One moves, the Secret Service owns the base. And not only do they own the base, they own all the airspace on top of it. So we couldn't taxi, we couldn't take off, we couldn't land when Air Force One was moving unless the Secret Service told us to. So Sass is trying to get a hold of the Secret Service because he's thinking, if I can talk to the Secret Service, maybe they can get in touch with the president and maybe we can get airborne that way. Dan Raisin Kane, who was our weapons officer, and a weapons officer in a fighter squadron is the thought leadership. They are the lead instructor pilot. They are the top gunnist of all the top guns in a fighter squadron. So they do they are the tactical leadership for the squadron. And so Raisin is calling down to the bomb dump where we keep all of our weapons. And he's telling them, okay, I need you guys to build me up some AIM-9, some heat-seeking Sidewinder missiles, and make sure that they're real. These are not captive air training missiles. I need munitions. I need the fuses. I need the rocket motors. I need the explosives, live weapons, and get them to the flight line as fast as you can. What's really incredible about that piece of the story is the leadership and the credibility that Raisin had with those troops, because we're in good guy land. We're at home. And this is we're in the military, the world's largest bureaucracy, right? We don't do anything without a paper trail. And here's Raisin calling down there and saying, build me up live weapons and get them to the flight line as fast as you can. Normally it takes 3 days with the air tasking order to come down, and it tells weapons troops how many and what kind of weapons they need to build up. And Raisin's just saying, get them to the flight line as fast as you can. It's a testament to his leadership and the teamwork across everyone in the fighter squadron and maintenance, and then down to, the enlisted troops there in the bomb dump, how they would improvise and come together as a team, even though we were having to fight and combat something that we had never, ever been trained for. Like no one had ever imagined this, right? It was a failure of imagination. At the same time, Mark Drifter Valentine, it was his first day in the squadron, believe it or not. He was also a weapons instructor. He had just come to us from Nellis, and he was a scheduler. So he's actually on the phone going through a recall roster, trying to get as many pilots back onto base as possible. And if they were part-timers and they were airline pilots and they were stuck somewhere out, because remember the FAA grounded people, then find out where they were so that we could work retrieval operations with the 201st Airlift Squadron and be able to bring them back to base so that we could begin this kind of 24/7 combat air patrol surge. So that's what Drifter was doing. Our intelligence officer, David Nuts McNulty, I love Nuts. He's an intelligence officer, and he comes from this good line of Boston cops, right? So he's just good stock. He's also having to make this up as we go because we're not plugged into any active duty chain of command. No one is feeding us intelligence. We have no idea what's going on in terms of the Northeast air defense sector. So he's literally on the phone talking to the Potomac TRACON, so the air traffic control that governs the Washington D.C. airspace, and he's talking to air traffic controllers, and he also has his staff calling around to airline reservations desks. So he's doing what we now today call open source intelligence, trying to figure out what that air battle picture looks like. Believe it or not, that morning before everything cooked off, we had sent a 3-ship of jets down to the Dare County ranges. And Air Force Dare County are their bombing ranges in North Carolina down off of Cape Hatteras. And they were just going to go do some basic surface attack bombing. Our supervisor of flying, who's kind of they manage the daily flight operations. So they're also an instructor pilot. They're also part of squadron leadership. That day, it was Phil Dog Thompson. And Dog was an old F4 guy. He had a big, fluffy Vietnam mustache and a ton of good common sense. I just idolized Dog. He calls down to the Dare County Ranger and says, "Hey, look, we've had something going on. We need you to send the bullies home as fast as possible and tell them to Buster, come home as fast as they can." The bullies that morning, that flight was made up. It was led by Lou Shooter Campbell. Bully 2 was another lieutenant in the squadron, Eric Puck Hagenson. And Bully 3 was Billy Hutchison. Now, Puck had bingoed out early, so he had used up his tactical fuel. And so he had been sent home while Shooter and Billy stayed on Air Force Dare County Range. They were going to do some strafing, so they were going to gun the rag. As Puck is coming home, the FAA is already starting to shut down the airspace. So they don't want to let Puck Bully 2 back into the Washington Class Bravo airspace. So Puck calls up the SOF, Dog, who's sitting there at the ops counter. And he goes, "Hey, Guard SOF, this is Bully 2. And Dog answers, he goes, "Okay, Bully 2. Guard SOF, go." SOF, I think that I got a problem here. Washington's not letting me into the airspace. What's going on? Well, we know on the ground what's going on, but the bullies don't, because they're not plugged into the news. They've not seen what's happening. So Dog tells him, "Don't you worry about that. You just come home and land." So a few minutes later, Puck calls back because Dog had gotten on the phone. He was talking to air traffic control. He goes, "Okay, no. The bullies they're ours. They belong to us. Let Bully 2 in, and he's going to be followed by Bully 1 and Bully 3. Make sure they get home expeditiously as fast as possible." So Dog smooths all of that out. Billy comes in, he lands, and it was a couple weeks later before things slowed down enough for me to be able to listen to his tapes. As you come in, as any pilot comes into a towered airport, there's a system called the Aerodrome Terminal Information System, ATIS for short. We love our acronyms. And what it is, it's a recorded loop every hour, and it has an alphanumeric code. So Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, etc. And so when you listen to it and then you call up the tower, you tell them what code you have. I've got information Zulu, I've got information Quebec. And that way they know if you've got the updated information, which is the landing runway, the barometric pressure, the winds, the ceiling of the clouds, and so forth. So when Puck comes in, he dials up the Andrews ATIS, and this is what it says. "This is Andrews Air Force Base Information Bravo. Andrews Air Force Base is closed. Washington Class Bravo airspace is closed. Any aircraft attempting to enter Washington Class Bravo airspace will be shot down." It was after the Pentagon was hit before we finally got the authorization to launch. General Worley is trying to work with his lawyers with the JAGs to figure out, can he launch us based off of self-defense? When the Secret Service finally gets a hold of us, because Vice President Cheney says, "Aren't there fighters at Andrews? Somebody get them airborne." And that's when we get the call. Sass looks at me and says, "Lucky, you're with me. Raisin, you and Igor, Brandon Rasmussen, he was a young captain in the squadron. You guys wait till you get missiles. Lucky, let's go." And I'm running after Sass down the hallway, down into life support where all of our flight gear is. And I'm, double checking because we're doing this really quickly, making sure I have everything that I need. My harness, my DTC, my lineup card, my checklist, and I'm zipping up my flight suit. When Sass looks at me and says, "I'll ram the cockpit." And I would ram my jet into the tail. We knew we didn't have live munition. I mean, we each had 105 rounds of training bullets, right? So basically think of them as 20 millimeter BB guns. It's just a lead nose shot that we used to strafe the rag down a dare, right? But even with 105 rounds of bullets each, we knew that would not be enough to take down an airliner. And we had seen the videos. We could see the smoke from the Pentagon, from the ops building. So we knew it had to be done. And I remember running after SAS, out the ops building, and how spectacular, gorgeous the sky was, and the shadows of the leaves of the cottonwood trees as they dappled on the grass. And SAS runs to his jet, and I run to mine. Now, you have to remember, I'm a green lieutenant. I'm still really new in my squadron, but I knew that if anything mattered in my life, getting it right, it was now. And every pilot knows that when you deviate from your checklist, when you start breaking your habit patterns, that's when the accident chain begins. That's when mistakes start getting made. So I'm going to go through my checklist. I'm going to do all of my habit patterns. I'm just going to do them as fast as possible. So I run up to my jet and I grab the forms from my crew chief. I start looking through the forms, and SAS was already up in his. And he goes, "Lucky, what the heck are you doing? Get in the jet." And that's when I realized, not only we knew time mattered, but I would have to throw the book out. There was no time for checklists. There was no time for habit patterns. I was going to have to make up my own procedures for scrambling. You see, I had never been trained to scramble. That was something you did if you were nuclear certified, which was not us. We didn't do the nuke mission. Or that was something you did if you were an alert squadron. Again, not us. And even if you were alert squadron, there were things that you had to do to what we hot cock the jet. So you would start the jet up, you set up all of the systems, and there was a different way that you would shut it down so that you could basically jump in, turn on the ignition, and go. But our jets were cold, and we didn't have GPS. We had these, we had ring laser gyros, INS, and it took 8 minutes to spin up. And so we didn't have 8 minutes. We needed to get started now. And the other thing that we would have to improvise is what were we going to do with the target? I had received training on hijacking procedures, and that was all based off of the 1970s, right? You do an intercept, you taxi up, you wave at the terrorists, "Hey, go to 1215," and you talk to them on the radio, "Follow me," and you land them somewhere so that then the hostage negotiators can start doing the negotiation process on the ground. This was not that world, and you wouldn't have known that it was different unless you had seen the videos. That morning we lived in two different worlds. You lived in a post 9/11 world, and you lived in a pre 9/11 world. So SAS says, "Lucky, what the hell are you doing? Get in the jet." I tumble up there. My crew chief doesn't even tuck me in with my harness. He just yanks the ladder, and I'm having to basically rely on my own systems knowledge to improvise something I'd never been trained for. And the minimum things I had to do was turn, master battery on, JFIS start 2, watch the RPM, 20%, go idle, watch for the RPM and the temperature, so 40% less than 750 degrees. Okay, it's a good start. I had to do my sec check, I had to do my EPU check, I had to get the flickest to bit 43, and I was done. And I'm starting to roll. And I remember SAS is starting to taxi, and I'm yelling at my crew chief. He's plugged into the jet, right? And I'm yelling, "Pull the chocks, pull the chocks." And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to jump the chocks in afterburner. And they yank the chocks. And so I'm taxiing after SAS. I'm trying to catch up with him. And as I look down, my crew chief, he's still plugged in. And he's pulling the pins out of my gear, the safety pins, right? Pins out of my gear, pins out of my TERS, pins out of my external fuel tanks. And there are other crew chiefs on the other side of the jet doing the same thing, pulling those pins. And then before my crew chief pulls his cord, he says, "Godspeed." And I followed SAS down taxiway Echo. We take off on runway 1 right. And we headed to the northwest over the Pentagon and out to the Pennsylvania countryside. Because based off of what Nuts had said and the conversations he'd had with Potomac Approach, we knew that there was one coming in low, probably over the river. And there might have been up to 3 based off of his counting, but they were concerned about one coming in low over the river. And we headed out that way. We're spread wide, and we're searching with our radars low, and we never found anything. SAS takes us maybe 100 miles out looking, but he gets us to a point where we've sanitized the airspace from that access. And he knows that this wedge of airspace is clear. So he calls Ranch House, and we turn back around to DC, and he sets us up in a counter-rotating cap. We wouldn't find out later that Flight 93 was the aircraft that we were searching for. And we also wouldn't find out later until we had reconstructed the timeline, that the passengers on Flight 93 were the real heroes, that they were the ones that protected our nation's capital, and that they took their fates into their hands and sacrificed themselves. They're the true heroes.
All right. So I certainly think the 44 people who were on that plane were heroes. I know Todd Beamer's last words were, I think, "Let's roll."
That's right.
When they decided to go after the terrorists.
That's right.
But the two of you were certainly heroes as well. And here's what I'm trying to figure out. So SAS tells you, "I'm going to hit the cockpit," and you hit the tail. What goes through your mind at that point? What emotions goes through you? I mean, do you just automatically obey the order, or do you begin to understand the gravity of what this is going to mean to your life or the loss of your life?
So first, let me say, yes, the passengers on Flight 90, they are truly, and what makes them even more heroic, and I didn't realize this till much later, not a single one of those passengers had been prior military. They were all just ordinary Americans, which I think really places their sacrifice in a totally different context. But what was going through my mind when SAS says, I'll take the, because he's thinking, okay, I'm going to take out the terrorists and I'm going to take out their ability to control the aircraft. I would take the tail, because without the empennage, the aircraft becomes aerodynamically unstable. It literally can't fly forward. I mean, it just ends up tipping basically and would go straight down into the ground. And that would minimize any kind of collateral damage, because it would keep the debris field so tight. And there's no way that they could overcome the loss of the empennage. But every single pilot that day, every single person on the ground in our squadron, they wanted to be part of this. I can guarantee you that Raisin and Igor would have much rather been in our place than waiting for missiles, because this is what we do. We protect and we defend, we serve, and our nation called. What SAS and I were willing to do that day was not unusual or special, not only for any military member, any one of us who is in that squadron, but frankly for any American, and the passengers of Flight 93 proved that day. I did not have any fear. I wasn't anxious. I had an incredible sense of calm about me, almost an emotional detachment. Because if God had put me in that position, then that was my purpose. And the other thing that went through my mind, dear God, don't let me fuck this up. I'll be straight with you. That's seriously what I was thinking. Don't let me screw this up, right? Because it mattered. What we did mattered.
My guess it was the former. It's so overwhelmingly powerful that if there was ever a place where that word should be used, it's right there.
I'm sorry. I know you can edit that out if you need to.
I'm not going to edit that out. So the day goes on. Tell me about the rest of the day. What happens with the crew when you get back? Finish off this story, and then we'll talk about some other areas.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was a long day. It was a long, long day. Sass and I stayed airborne. Raisin and Igor finally got those missiles. They take off. So Sass puts us in an X cap. Before Sass and I were doing a counter rotating cap. So someone was always looking east and someone was always looking west. They get airborne. He puts us in an X cap. So I believe Sass had the northeast leg. Raisin had the southwest or northwest leg. Raisin had the southwest leg. I had the northeast leg, and Igor had the southeast leg. At that point in time, the Quits, a pair of F-16s, Duluth fighters that had been sitting alert down at Langley, a detachment down at Langley, when they had been scrambled, they took off on their predetermined flight plan off out over the Atlantic. And then they kind of got stuck out there because when the FAA shut down all the airspace, they couldn't get back in. When they finally got back in, they were up at 18,000 feet. And so Potomac says, hey, Caps, we've got the Quits. They're trying to get a hold on with you on this frequency. So Sass sent me over to talk with them. He and I stayed tied up on the VHF radio frequency because Sass was talking with Potomac. And I'll tell you, those air traffic controllers were amazing. It's truly a testament to their professionalism and their skill, because their normal job is to sequence aircraft in through known flight routes and keep them separated. And suddenly now their job is to watch a broad swath of airspace and identify unknown aircraft and facilitate our intercept. So Sass and Raisin work with them to teach them how to speak go from air traffic controller to air battle manager, right? So, okay, if you've got this navigational facility, navigational radio beacon on Reagan National Airport, let's just call that bullseye, right? And if there's a target that's to the east of Reagan National Airport for 10 miles at 3,000 feet, I want you to say bullseye 090 for 10 at 3,000. And that tells us as fighter pilots what direction to look. And then we can correlate our radar contacts with the information that they've just given us. And like that, I'll tell you, Potomac air traffic controllers immediately were able to switch their mindsets. It was really phenomenal how they were able to adapt so quickly. And so they're calling out contacts, and then they start adding on what the transponder code is, what the origin of the contact was, what their destination is, and if they know who they are. And that was helpful to us because we could then basically declutter our scope, if you will. We would still get the radar contacts. We would still get the paints on our radar, but we could know which one of those little squares, those little green squares, were good guys, unknowns, because the unknowns we were looking for in case they were bad guys. So it was really that what Potomac Air Traffic Control did that day was just spectacular in their response. So they let us know that the Northeast Air Defense Sector, NEADS, is calling down, and they want us to make connections with the Quits. So SAS had the Quits stay up high at about 18,000 feet to do a high cap. That lets them have a much longer look while we manage the low cap. And NEADS sent a tanker out, so we refueled. And then when there was another set of pilots and jets with missiles ready, then SAS and I landed. They took off, took our place in the cap. SAS gave a debriefing to senior leadership of the Air National Guard, and then we came back and jumped in the jets and took off again that day. SAS and I were tasked to escort Air Force One back. So if you've seen the picture of the D.C. Guard F-16 off the left wing of Air Force One, that's a beautiful glamour shot of SAS, and brought him back in. But by then, things had started to calm down. We had begun to normalize the operations there for that DC cap, and we were able to start getting pilots who had been at home through the gate and start to generate more aircraft for the next day. What was amazing was how quickly our guardsmen responded, right? I mean, we didn't have paperwork. We didn't have mobilization orders. They just, our guardsmen, whether or not they were finance troops or intel troops or weapons guys or maintainers or loggies or whatever, when they saw what happened, and there was no way you could escape the television that day. When they saw what happened, they told their employers, "I'm sorry, boss, my nation needs me." And they got up and they left and they drove on to base. And their family sent them with food. So pretty much, our squadron was turned into 24/7 operations with cots in briefing rooms and blacked out windows and a huge buffet line of casserole dishes and cold cuts and things like that to keep us, to make sure that we were taken care of as everyone within the fighter squadron could focus on the mission. And our sister unit, the 201st Airlift Squadron, you remember, all the airlines, all civil aviation was grounded for 3 days. And a lot of our airline pilots who were a lot of our fighter pilots, airline pilots, were stuck out at all of these bases. And so the 201st went out and did a round robin and picked up all of our pilots to bring them home so they could then start be part of the combat air patrol as well.
All right. So in the I want to shift in a moment to talking about the changing role that the Air Force is having to play because of the changing dynamics. There's a new set of problems, but at that period of time, the problem was trying to deal with Al Qaeda, with terrorism. I know that you flew missions into Iraq. Tell me, you said that the military or the Air Force had been cut in half. Talk to me about the mission that the Air Force needed to play during that whole engagement, the engagement with trying to deal with terrorism, with Al Qaeda, and then with Iraq as well. What was the mission of the Air Force? What began to happen in the Air Force, and where were the areas that we were successful and the areas that we weren't successful as far as the Air Force was concerned?
What you ask is a very complex question, because while the Army was the preponderance of forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, and then later on, less so in Syria, the Air Force did most of the force employment. And so as we look back, I think it will be important to begin to disentangle from a strategic policy standpoint, what was our real objective in the Middle East after that? Because if you look at Afghanistan, where we dislodged the Taliban and we destroyed the training camps, and we said, and we worked with the Northern Alliance, and that was a really interesting and important campaign, because there you had air power, which was the only way you were really going to be able to bring to bear the concentration of force and the mass against those terrorists, was through air power, because of just how challenging the mountainous terrain was there. They were supported by special operations troops and the Northern Alliance. So a very small number of boots on the ground supporting by giving us coordinates and taskings, supporting air power to be able to bring in, again, that mass firepower. And we accomplished that mission. But then there was the sense that we needed to continue on into Iraq, and that if you break it, you buy it. So the Pottery Barn strategy, and that is what committed us long term to trying to reshape not just the governance but the cultures of Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think that the troops on the ground did their best to win hearts and minds, but I think that it may have been a mismatched strategy based off of our objectives and our goals. And with the trillions of dollars that our nation spent over there, and the blood and the wounded warriors that are truly paying the costs of those endeavors, what that also did was it sucked up the entire attention of our military forces. We were solely focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, which, while what happened on 9/11 was traumatic and horrific, it did not pose an existential threat. Everyone got up the next day and they were able to walk down to their corner Starbucks and still buy their, soy lattes. It didn't mean that, the attacks on American soil was a wake up regarding our vulnerabilities, but what the Taliban could do to us is very, very different and needed to be handled differently than a peer state competitor or adversary like China and Russia. And so what we see today is the choices that we made to defer recapitalization and modernization of the Air Force. And because also, as you mentioned, the nation cut our Air Force in half, we had to do more with less. So we spun these aircraft faster, wore them out faster, but we canceled their replacements and we slowed down their replacements. So, for example, the jet that I scrambled on 9/11, which was, by the way, produced in 1985, that jet is still a frontline fighter. 85 to 95, 05, 15, it is nearly 40 years old. And that's what we expect our young men and women to take into bad guy land. And that's why I do what I do today, because on 9/11, I was sent on a suicide mission because our nation was unprepared. We were short-sighted. We were unwilling to make the necessary investments in our national security. So I was sent on a suicide mission. And so I do what I do today with the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Power, such that the young men and women who wear the cloth of our country are not also sent on a suicide mission. And given the global environment and what China and Russia and the other standing obligations that we have to support Ukraine, support NATO, try to assure peace and stability throughout the globe, that they're not also sent on a suicide mission.
All right, so you are involved with, you retired as a major, you're involved in the Mitchell Institute. Mm-hmm. If you would, tell me what the Mitchell Institute does. What's the purpose and the reason for its existence?
So the Mitchell Institute is a think tank, and we're underneath the umbrella of the Air Force Association, but we're an independent organization. And as a think tank, we do defense and national security policy analysis. We are focused on educating and advocating and cultivating air power and next generation's airmen. So as a senior fellow at the Mitchell Institute, I study everything ranging from advanced operational concepts to future warfare to advanced technologies to try to provide insight and provide guidance and recommendations to senior leaders regarding our Air Force and regarding employing air power smartly.
So and by the way, I will give you my opinion, and I just love, feel free to disagree with it or to tell me maybe where I'm missing something. But my view is that there's a huge strategic change that's taking place in the United States. And that strategic change is based around the idea that we did fight a war against terrorists for the last probably 15 or 20 years. By the way, I think we shouldn't doubt how successful we were in that, both in Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We've fairly neutered those organizations. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other jihadist groups that are coming up behind them, but we were successful at something that many people thought in the beginning strategically was going to be very difficult to do. My belief today is that these near peer groups, China, Russia, both pose a very different threat to us. And the threat that they pose to us is one of this kind of authoritarian axis, and I'm going to include Iran in that group, where
Yes,
if they can change the spheres of influence, they begin to dramatically reshape the world order that we know of today. So Russia is looking at or is eyeing Europe, and it's not just about Ukraine, it's about Poland, Lithuania, other places. It's breaking down NATO. In Asia, it's the South Pacific, which includes Japan, Malaysia, Taiwan, Vietnam. It's other areas to control that sphere. And in the Middle East, Iran has that same goal. There's always been this Shia-Sunni split between the differing groups. But I think there's little doubt if the United States wasn't there, that Iran would be the hegemon of the Middle East. And in fact, I think that's the one goal that all three of them have in common. They want the U.S. to go away. Now, my own belief is if we go away, it wouldn't make any difference because at some point in time, they'd begin to strangle us, our economy, and our ability to move forward because I believe that Western liberal democracy by itself is a threat to them. But nonetheless, there's no doubt from an international standpoint, at least in my mind, we have these three spheres of influences, and it's now really about hierarchy versus the rule of law versus the American world order, which, by the way, has done more to lift prosperity than any other period of time in world history. Do you see that as being the same threat that I see it as being? And then are we on track? Well, maybe on track's the wrong word. Are we putting together the right set of steps to make certain that we can be engaged in that type of conflict and be successful? It is effectively a three-front war.
Paul, you're absolutely correct. I mean, this struggle is a struggle for the global order. And there is no doubt in my mind that cricket, right? China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and extremist terrorism, they want to rewrite the global order such that it favors them and their philosophy and their paradigm for how not just economies work, and they certainly don't believe in a rule of law, but those kinds of processes, and that's whether or not it's freedom or who gets rich or how societies run, and they want to own all of that. And it's very different, as you mentioned, from the liberal democratic philosophy that the United States, after implementing that after World War II, has created such a flourishing global economy and has risen the standards of living and standards of hope for nearly everyone across the world. So you and I are in complete agreement with that. The strategic myopism that the United States evidenced over the last 20 years of operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria did go far in dismantling the Taliban, dismantling ISIS, and other extremist terrorism. Now, do I think we could have had a better strategy and one that allowed us to perhaps prevent the meteoric rise of China? We left a massive power vacuum in the globe because we were so focused, because we were so committed. I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. I think we could have done both, but only time and some distance and historical analysis will allow us to be able to get that kind of clarity regarding of could have, would have, should have. But what I think is clear is that focus and that dedication of resources, especially of treasure and military forces, created this opportunity for China to rise, created an opportunity for Russia to begin its revanchist strategies and place them into periods of opportunity that they are now seeking to seize.
You had made mention a moment ago about 35-year-old military equipment and planes that we're working with. Can you talk to me about how we're doing with both fifth-generation warfare at the F-35s? I know that we have a place out in Arizona with the Luke Air Force Base that does some training of the F-35s, but also maybe more importantly, what's happening with sixth generation?
So with fifth generation aircraft, which is the F-22 and the F-35, Secretary Bob Gates decided to cancel the F-22 program well short of its program of record. It originally had been planned to buy 750 of those aircraft to fully replace the F-15 fleet. He terminated the program at 187 aircraft because he did not believe that China would ever be a problem. As a result, the Air Force is now still flying F-15s. As a matter of fact, about 5 or 7 years ago, one of those F-15s just spontaneously disintegrated in flight because it was so old. So we don't have the numbers of F-22s that we really need to be able to execute that air superiority mission. The F-35 is we are buying that aircraft at too slow of a rate, which is why the F-16 that I flew is still in the inventory. We should be buying more F-35s faster to be able to turn the fleet over and retire some of this legacy iron, not only because it's not as relevant to that pure flight, but it is just old and tired and worn out. And we owe it. It is a moral obligation to our airmen to give them the equipment that they need to go into bad guy land, do their mission successfully, and come home safely. That's the best family program there is. We need to get that up on production rate so we can really retire those legacy iron. You mentioned sixth generation. I would place the B-21 in that category, which is the Air Force's new bomber. I believe they have 3 now. They've already had their first flight. That program is on track. It is doing well. And again, we need to buy them as fast and as quickly as possible because the B-21 has the legs, it has the survivability, and it has the offensive capability that our nation and our airmen need to be able to execute what we expect them to do to be able to protect our interests and assure our allies, protect our allies' interests as well. Next generation air dominance is it's very secretive. We are still waiting to hear more about the companies that will be participating there, but the Air Force is moving forward with that. What I can tell you about the B-21 and the next generation air dominance, so they have not down selected. We don't yet have a specific fighter in mind for next generation air dominance. Air Force lingo, we call it NGAD. Both of those work as a family of systems. So they will work with other aircraft types, whether or not that's autonomous drones or space satellites. They will work as a system of systems to be able to accomplish their mission. And that will make them not only more effective, but they'll make them more resilient as well, because we know that the adversary will try to shoot down, disrupt, jam, or otherwise degrade those operations. So as a family of systems, it gives more resilience to those mission sets.
When you talk about systems, can you talk a little bit about unmanned aircraft, both the moral and technical implications of that, and whether you see that as being something where we are working as a system between the two, or at some point do we actually end up beginning to move completely to unmanned spacecraft?
We will never have, people say, oh, it's the end of the fighter pilot. That's not true. We will always have humans within the battle space. And I'll tell you why. Because our brains are the best. It's the best AI out there, right? The value of human cognition, human decision making, human judgment, and frankly, our innovation, our imagination, and our unpredictability is a virtue in warfare. It's a virtue, period, dot, but it's a virtue in warfare. We do need to have unmanned combat aircraft, partly because we have shrunk the Air Force so much that we right now cannot dig out of the hole that was started in the 1990s. People need to understand, successful military operations are not efficient. They are effective. And to be effective requires a little bit of inefficiency, a little bit of overhead. But for too long, our nation has demanded that we be just in time, just enough. And if we have better tech, then we can do it with less. And now that just simply means we're doing more with less and less and less. We do not have the ability to, or the funding to buy as many manned aircraft as we need, to produce as many pilots as we need, as the battle space and the strategic demands require. So we have to augment those numbers with unmanned combat aircraft. Those aircraft will always be working in conjunction with humans in some kind of way. If they're tiny little drone swarms, they'll probably have a human controller, using a Game Boy or something on the other end, giving them broad mission commands. Go out and look at this. Okay, go out and swarm there. If it is more of what the Air Force is beginning to imagine as attritable or an expendable vehicle, which can fly, hundreds of nautical miles, is much larger. They will still collaborate with each other and with humans within the battle space to accomplish their mission. So we're not talking about moving into a Terminator kind of world. That's not the best use of this technology, and frankly, it's also not our ethos as American warriors. And like I said, I just don't think that if you were to completely let the vehicle and the autonomy work by itself, I think you would introduce a lot of attack space or attack area for the adversary with their cyber attacks. So humans will always be essential to the successful operation and collaboration of these new technologies.
So with three potential fronts, again, Europe, Asia, as well as what's going on in the Middle East. Any idea of where we are on the budget today for the Air Force and where you think we really need to be with these new competing theaters of war?
So I have three major concerns for the Air Force. One is that the Air Force is having to recapitalize two legs of the nuclear triad. And all three legs, nuclear submarines, nuclear bombers, that's the B-21, and that in both the subs and the bombers include modernizing the nuclear weapons themselves, and then the ground-based strategic deterrent. That's the new ICBMs, right? The Sentinel program to replace the Minuteman III. The Air Force is recapitalizing two legs of the nuclear triad to include all of the command and control system. That is a massive, massive budget wedge. That is a huge cost. It is a must-do for our nation, and they're having to do them both at the same time because we have been penny wise and pound foolish, deferring and kicking the can of modernization and recapitalization down the road to the point where we now can no longer defer the recapitalization. So that is one thing that's causing tremendous pressure on the Air Force budget. The second is not only are we having to recapitalize those two programs, but very nearly every other combat system that the Air Force has, whether or not that's rescue helicopters, the F-16, the F-15, replacing bombers. There are so many major weapon systems and weapons that need to be recapitalized and replaced with newer, better technology. And again, same story, penny wise, pound foolish, defer, defer, defer. And now we face a massive crisis of just all these programs piling up on each other. That's a huge problem. And then when you look at how the OSD is allocating funding, one of the challenges the Air Force faces there is it appears to be doing well, except that there's this thing called pass-through. Pass-through is money that the Air Force doesn't control and doesn't go to Air Force programs. Basically, people get their they'll get upset when I say this, but basically, Air Force is laundering money for other government agencies within the DoD, other DoD agencies. So it's money that's in their budget space, and for example, it takes up 40% of their procurement dollars, but they never see a penny of that budget. So what you think the Air Force is getting for its budget is not getting at all, and so that obscures the real money that the Air Force is getting when you take out pass-through and you rightfully put it within DoD agencies. The way that it shakes out is Navy, the Fourth Estate, which is DoD and all of their agencies, and then the Army, and then the Air Force, and then the Marine Corps and the Space Force. So that's the challenge the Air Force faces, is that it's having to do all of these things at once, yet it doesn't have the budget necessary to be able to do that. If you look at some of the strategic choices China has made in order to be able to modernize their forces, they've chosen to take risk in areas where they can rapidly reconstitute. And that means that they've chosen to take risk in their army because they can reconstitute a lot of their army capabilities, namely infantrymen, fairly rapidly. But it takes time to do the technology development, takes time to build the ships, takes time to build the missiles. So that's where they have decided to invest their funding and take risk on things that they can do fairly quickly.
How do we line up with the Chinese Air Force and military in your mind?
So I think right now, if you just go technology v technology, I would say hands down the U.S. is more advanced, but we are losing that edge. There, because we trained so many Chinese engineers in U.S. universities, we have taught them a lot of our secret sauce, right? When I not actual secret, we've taught them a lot of our American magic in our universities, and they're taking that back home. China's not stupid. Their engineers are not stupid. So they are developing very excellent technologies. Do I believe that they're as good as the Americans? No, because I think there's still something really special about the creativity that is core to our American identity. That's really hard to replicate in some, especially in China, right? But they are making the investments, they're making the long-term investments, and they're consistent with those investments. So it's not necessarily just that they're able to do things faster, which they can because they're a centralized economy, but because they retain that commitment, they never make the investment and then terminate, and then have to reinvent the wheel, invest, and then terminate. They're just the fact that they remain committed is what's allowing them to make this progress and begin to field at a rate that is troubling.
So there's, what seems to me, I spent my life on the political end, so I guess I should ask for my indulgence here. But nonetheless, you have the fighting men and women who are engaged on the front and having to deal with what's happening from a battle standpoint. You then have the procurement side, the technology side, how it is that we gain in new types of equipment, new types of technology. But then you have the political end, and the political end is where the budgetary issues rest, where the strategic decisions are being made by politicians that may avoid a short-term problem but end up causing a long-term problem. I think that's what's going to take place with Ukraine. I think if we're not actively engaged in making certain that we resolve that short-term problem, we're going to have a much more expensive long-term solution. It's a lot more expensive when it gets to our shore than when it's over there. Now, saying that, I guess I'm interested in your optimism that we'll fix this problem, that we will have the ability to rise up and deal with this. Because to give our politicians some credit, the one area that we've seen great cooperation in Congress from both Democrats and Republicans is trying to deal with the Chinese threat that's taking place and recognizing it for what it is. I'd love to hear your view. Is it optimistic or pessimistic about our ability to be able to rise up and meet this challenge?
Let me answer your question in two ways. First, on the political side, we're seeing a lot of very level-headed representatives and senators of integrity, of common sense, who are willing to work towards solving particular issues, regardless of party. They are choosing not to run. They are self-selecting out of Congress because Congress is so dysfunctional. It is so rancorous. It is so vitriolic. It does not represent the best of who we are as Americans. And I don't believe that either political party, the Democrats or the Republicans, are actually interested in what America really needs. They're not interested in solutions. They're interested in retaining the problem, which is why they feed the hate machine. That's why I am not optimistic. I mean, just take a look. We have failed to pass a budget. We failed to pass a budget because both parties are so intransigent that they're unwilling to give up their political interest for the nation's interest. But when it comes to Americans, I am so optimistic. When it comes to neighbors, I am so optimistic. But what we have to do is we have to get off the hate machine. We have got to turn down the knobs on the media. We've got to reject the adrenaline of anger and self-righteousness and connect with our neighbors, connect with our community. Because when I think about the passengers on Flight 93, as I said, none of them had ever served, but they stepped up. They were heroes because the DNA that's in the greatest generation, it's still inside of us. It's just latent. We have to choose to connect with that. We have to choose to connect with the best of ourselves. And when we do that, we'll begin to see the best in other people and bring that out. So when it comes to Americans, I'm incredibly optimistic. When it comes to politicians and the political parties, frankly, I'm not. Until we, as the American population, reject the political rancor and polarization that is pulling our nation apart and realize we are not the enemy, that we've got to come together and we've got to work together. Even though we might not be on the same side of the aisle, it requires us to work together. And until we reward that, until we can have civil conversations, until we can embrace each other and connect through our differences, not in spite of them, that's what it's going to take for us to really overcome where we're at today. Don't buy into the hate. Choose to connect.
All right, so I'm going to give you some optimistic news in a moment.
I love that. I love that.
About the political side. But before I do, I want to get this last question to you, and that is, if there are, well, I'm going to say young girls, but young girls and young men that are out there that are thinking about making the Air Force their career, that are interested in being a pilot, would you recommend it for both of them? Do you think that there's a long-term career here for men and women in the Air Force? Is it something that you would see as being a positive light in their life? And you can throw anything into that question that you would like.
Oh my gosh,
I'm really interested in
absolutely.
your recommendation to young people.
I would go back and do it all over again, over and over and over. I loved my service. I loved the flying. I loved the people that I served with. And here's the other piece that I loved: what the service made me. You don't have to join the Air Force. You can join the Army. You can join the Marine Corps. You can join the Navy. You can join the Coast Guard. But the service transforms you into who you are meant to be. They really do turn you into the best version of yourself. It's not easy. It's hard. But you'll learn to love the challenge, and it will create a strength and integrity. It will forge that character inside of you. And you don't even have to be a pilot. You could do any one of the specialties within the military, enlisted or as an officer. But I would encourage any young person to join, because it will truly make you, turn you, transform you into who you are meant to be.
Thank you. All right, so here's the positive news. Look, I see it. Our political side is way underserving the greatness of America, not just underserving our military, not just underserving our private sector or business sector, but underserving the American people. That's partly happening because of the structure. You know, the existing structure that exists today. You have two political partisan primaries where literally, I could do the math for you, I'm not going to, but somewhere less than about 8% of the public participate in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. Today, 49% of Americans are identifying as independents. Now, the challenge is in 70% of those seats, there's no contest in the general election because they've gerrymandered the seats to where they're safe. Now, imagine this. Imagine, just think creatively for a moment and say, okay, you have, I have two groups of people. One group is a positive, optimistic, very pro-American, believes in, they're optimistic. The other group is pessimistic. They're worried, they're fretting, and they have grievances They're angry at the other side. In fact, if you ask them the number one thing they want to do, it is generally flip a bird to the people in the other party. If you get down to that low a percentage of people who are controlling the system, which group do you think votes more? The people with a grievance or the people that are optimistic? Pretty much most people would say, yeah, the grievance group would be higher. Americans are recognizing it. You talked about the American media. I am so upset with the American media because they're better than this and they're fueling that problem. But the structure is the key.
Yep.
If you change the structure, you change everything. All we need to do is to find a way to ensure at every election that big group in the middle, the independents, people who are Democrat, people who are Republican, that they're participating. People are seeing it. Americans are seeing it. There are efforts going on all around the country talking about reform. I've never seen as much conversation around reform in my political existence as I see right now. And that's because Americans want something better. We are going to change this political system, and we're going to change this in a way in which that stops the discrimination that's happening against those people who are independent or unaffiliated, or the people who are on the left and the right, who oftentimes, as you said, there are people leaving the two political parties. I think both political parties offer a great deal to the United States. We need both of them. I mean, I can't imagine this country without Jefferson and Hamilton.
True.
Both of them played a massive role in the development of our society, and it's true today. We need people who are concerned about education and that are concerned about our neighborhoods and our quality of life, and we also need people who are worried about our safety and about protecting us and making certain that the bad guys aren't able to do what they would like to do. Those two types of thinking oftentimes separate themselves by which political party they're in, but they're the best of us. We're allowing a very small group of people to dominate the system, and that's going to change. It's going to change because effectively the American public is becoming fed up with it. I hear it over and over again. I speak to college students. I go out and I meet with seniors and the elderly and other people, not just in Arizona, but around the country. There is a cry for something better. They recognize that our political system isn't living up to what we need it to live up to. And the one thing I found over and over again, like it or not, in a democracy, when you get a big, huge, large percentage of the majority wanting change, change is going to happen. The hope is that it happens in time, because I do think that we have some severe risks on our border. I think we have some severe risks across the globe, and we have to rise up to the challenge. This challenge is as big as any challenge we've had since the Soviet Union. It's as big as what we saw with the Axis powers that happened in World War II. You can hear it from our military people and leaders and the people who are involved in strategy. They know it. They understand it. That message is starting to get out. And again, here's where I'm optimistic. If we engage all of the American public, we'll fix this problem.
I am hopeful that you are right, and I am hopeful that we can generate the mechanisms for that change. Because I don't think the political parties, the leadership of the political parties, are incentivized to embrace that. Otherwise, they already would have moved more to the center. Because I agree with you, the vast majority of Americans do not feel like they are adequately represented. And they don't participate in either of the primaries because they feel disenfranchised there. And so we end up having to make choices about the edge and vote for the least of all evils. So I hope that there's a mechanism, whether or not that's a third party or something, to drive the parties a little bit back more towards the center, because you're right. They both offer important perspectives and specific interests and core values that are crucial for us to integrate, as well as act as a check and a balance. So how we get there, I'm really interested to see that, because count me in.
Well, have faith and hang on, as they say. Heather, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being on our program. More importantly, what an amazing life and service you've given to this country. I know that you're representative of a much larger group. But just from my standpoint and from the people who watch the show, thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. And I'd be happy to chat with you again.
Oh, we will definitely have you on again. In fact, use this as an outlet. If you have issues that you want to talk about, we'd love to have you on to talk about things that you see as being important.
You bet. All right. I've got to run, so I'll talk to you later.
Godspeed. As special as Major Heather Penny is, she is representative of one of the finest group of people that I've ever met, and that's the veterans of the United States. There's so much that we have to play in our role in the world, and these military people go where they need to go, oftentimes questions unasked, being willing to risk their very lives. Their families end up having to go through things that we oftentimes can't recognize. Here at the Optimistic American, what we're trying to do is to rekindle that American spirit that lets us know that there are things that we can still accomplish, great things that we can take part in. We have some big threats, as we talked about in this show. We're going to continue to talk about them. Now, if you like the work that we're doing, press that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you anything. We'd love for you to take part. Or go to optamerican.com/premium and become one of our premium members. And always leave us a comment. Your comments matter to us. We read them. We enjoy listening to them, and it gives us an idea of the things that you'd like us to be talking about. Again, this is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. Godspeed, and thanks for being with us today.